Okay, so when you're opening up Blender for the first time, what you'll see is this welcome screen. You'll notice here that I'm at version 2.82a, and that will also be reflected right down here in the lower right-hand corner. So the first thing we're going to do here is just choose General, and that will open up the general scene with one cube in the center of my screen and a lot of stuff to think about. So let's go through this just as an intro for 2.82, which is important. They recently did a revamp on the version, so you do want to make sure you're in the right version to follow along. So I'm going to start from up here and work our way around. So the file menu here, and all of these are just the basic flyout menus, so you should have no problem with that. I'm going to jump into the preferences very quickly because some of my hotkeys might be bound in a different way. So that's really right under here under key map. So key map is basically how do the keystrokes align with certain commands that are set within Blender in this case, but in any software programs. They're shortcuts or hotkeys, key map, right? All of those are the same, or at least similar. So here I am going to be using industry compatible. I'm an old Maya user, so I'll be using Maya hotkeys, which is the industry compatible. You might be watching some other tutorials online or something like that, where you might want to flip back over to use the Blender hotkeys that they might be talking about in that tutorial. But in this tutorial series, we will be using industry compatible. So make sure that you have that, or you're willing to take the time to convert what the industry compatible is over to your Blender hotkeys. One thing to note, which is really nice that you can do within this preference window box, is to come into Blender, for example, and choose either the key binding. So in this case, I could do something like Control N, right? And I could literally type that in, and it will show me all of the different hotkeys from the Blender source that correspond with the keyboard setting, and you can customize these. So this, you do have to make sure that key binding is part of your search credential. You could also come over here if you know the name of a tool, you're just not sure what the hotkey is. You could say something like new, right? And it will give you all of the hotkeys associated with that word new. So that's really, really helpful. And then if you hear a hotkey or a command, but it doesn't quite align and you're in one or the other, you can always sort of use this as a cheat sheet to search. Google works really well too, so don't be afraid to Google. So name is the name of the command. Key binding is actually what you're typing in. So those are two distinctions that are important. So again, just make sure that you are set to industry compatible under key map. And again, I found that under edit and preferences. Okay, so now we should be working well together. So that's all of this right here. Up here at the top, you'll see some of these tabs, which are different spaces, different workspaces within Blender. So if I start to click through them, a lot of these we will not use in this series, but it is useful to understand that there are some that are set up. So I'm going to jump over here to layout and get rid of some of these to maximize for my Blender save. So I'm simply going to right click and choose delete. I'll delete that scripting one. Compositing we won't need. Rendering and animation I'll keep, and shading I'll keep. We're not going to be painting. We're not going to be UV editing, and we're not going to be sculpting or modeling actually. So these four, keep it nice and tight there. If there's any, let's say I got rid of animation on accident, I can always use this little plus sign, and you can see that there are general, there's 2D animation, which is a bit different than what we'll be doing with the 3D animation, sculpting, VFX. There's a lot of different spaces, and you can also duplicate your current layout into its own customized shelf. So that's really helpful. So I can bring animation back and then, have those up there for me. So great, so that's the top right here. Over here, there's some other view layers, render layers, those types of things, which we're not going to really mess with, so I'm going to just grace over them. One thing I do want to note is this little button right here. Now, if you're familiar with any Adobe programs, or many programs actually, they do have this sort of panel workspace. So right here is my viewport, and it takes up a fairly large size. We can customize the panels like this, right? And this panel, there's actually a small one down here, which I'll pop up a little bit so you can see it a little bit better behind my head. There we go. And this is the the timeline, right? So each one of these panels has a corresponding little button to it in the upper left-hand corner. So this shows us what type of editor we are looking at within that panel, within that rectangle or square. So in this case, you'll notice that it looks like a little grid with a sphere on it. So that's my 3D viewport. I could easily switch this over to something like the graph editor, and now in that panel, it will take that as the editor and show me that. So if you notice that any of your panels don't look like mine, it could be that you're in a different tab, but it could also be that you inadvertently activated a different type of editor. So this is really helpful. Just a very quick glance to the upper left-hand corner of each one of the panels will tell you what is being displayed in that, and you can toggle back and forth. So that's our little editor type. Over here, this has to do with the active tool. So these are sort of the tool settings or tool attributes, very similar to the Adobe landscape, such as Photoshop. So you would activate a tool over here in your sort of tool shelf, and then it would populate some of the most commonly used tool settings up at the top. So we'll also see that over here in this side, sort of like the attribute editor if you're used to Maya or anything like that, but we'll see that in just a moment, and I'll draw attention to that. So after you select a different tool, you'll notice that that section right there changes depending on what tool is active. So coming over to the middle, we can see that these are different types of orientations for specifically for transform. So there's global, the traditional up, down, left, right, X, Y, Z, and then there's different ways that we can adjust that. We're not really going to touch on that, but we'll mostly stay in global for this course. This section here, again, we're not going to touch on, but it's helpful to know where some of these things are. We can see that snapping, you can engage right here as a simple toggle. And there's also snap to what, right? So are we going to snap to the increment, the vertex, edge, face? Again, maybe we might get into that, but those are our snapping features right there. Same thing here. So this is editing objects and editing some of the fall off. So in Maya, this would be soft select. So, that's, again, more for modeling, less so for some of the stuff that we'll be doing here. Up here at the top, these are, again, not too much that we'll be looking at, but just some options based off of the 3D viewport. Just down from there, we will be using these buttons quite frequently, and these are what we can see in the viewport and how we actually go about using that. So the first one here with the little eyeball and the arrow shows me what I can actually see. So in Maya, this would be the viewport menu set and choosing view and turning off some stuff. So for example, if I turned off this mesh, all of the meshes would be hidden within this viewport that corresponds with that. So I can really customize and streamline what I'm looking at. They're not gone, they're just hidden from this viewport. So that's this little button right here. The next space here is more about the what I call the gimbals, right? The actual object that you use, and let me just demonstrate it here. So these little arrows here, so the gizmo, right? So can we see it? Can we not see it? What happens with that? So that's what that's all about. This next one is overlays. So this is where I would go to turn on wireframe, to turn off the floor, to turn off the axes, right? And maybe do something that's more about the general overlay. These we will be using relatively frequently, and they correspond with the actual geometry within the scene. So this first one is the X-ray. This can be helpful to look through an object. It's sort of semi-transparent. A lot of riggers use this so that they can still see the mesh, but see the bones inside. This one is wireframe view. So we can see as I move around here, I see the cage, so to speak, of all of the geometry in the scene. So really here you only get one. So you can choose to have the viewport shading. That's just the regular sort of flat shade there. This one, as you can see, the light sort of changed a little bit. So this is also a different type of viewport shading. This incorporates some of the scene lights and gives you a little bit more of the shader visibility. And then this last one is supposed to try to mimic what a render would look like. It's a little bit more complex, so it's not a full render necessarily, but it is doing the best that it can based off of the fly. So great. So we're going to keep it mainly at this one, which is basically just flat shaded. And you can see here this little flyout menu will give us different options depending on which mode we're in. Okay. So there we go. So we'll stay within this one right here. the flat shaded, and we'll move down to this little colorful sphere. And as I highlight over that, you'll notice a little circle that pops up behind it, and some of the other little balls here tend to highlight as you move over them. Now I'll be using the hotkey, so I'll be holding down Alt on my keyboard and clicking and dragging with my mouse to sort of tumble around the scene, and we'll notice that this little space does change depending on this. So this is the orient. In Maya it's a cube, but in here it's a sphere, so I get a little tongue-tied there. So we can hold down Alt. It doesn't matter on your keyboard which one that you choose, but I'm a right-handed mouse person, so I typically use my left thumb and rest that on the Alt that's right to the left of the spacebar key, and then use my 4 fingers to activate some other hotkeys. So with my my left thumb on the Alt key, I'll hold that in and click and drag, just regular click and drag. So this would be your left mouse button in order to tumble around the scene. I can also push in my middle mouse button to go up, down, left, right. This is panning. And then the whole time I'm holding an Alt, and then holding an Alt and right mouse button, clicking and dragging to zoom in and out. Okay, now you'll see me do some of the zooming and it will be opposite because Maya's movements are opposite. There is a way to change that in the preferences, but I can't think of it right now. You can also scroll to zoom in and out, so it's really up to you. The scrolling isn't as precise, so I do recommend that you get into the habit of holding down Alt and using the mouse movement along with the right mouse button, the right click, if you will. So all of those commands you can also trigger up here. I tend to like to, be able to grab and kind of keep my navigation pretty tight, but you can, if that's way too many hotkeys for you, without any Alt on my keyboard, I can simply click and drag and move around the scene by using this button or this area right up here. I can also click on any one of the little spheres here to go to that orient, and then click and drag, which is nice. We'll go to the top-down view. Blender is a Z up environment. Maya is typically set to a Y up environment. So we'll talk about that in the future. So that's how we can very quickly tumble around. These other 2 buttons here will allow me to zoom in and out. So as I click and hold on that little zoom button, I can drag my mouse up and down, and that will allow me to zoom in or zoom out. This one is my pan. So as I click and hold over this, I can move left, right, up, and down. You'll notice that there's no tumbling motion there, and there's no in and out motion. So it's just a up, down, or left or right. This one right here will toggle us over to the animation camera or AniCam, the render cam. So we'll see that this black box comes in and it really shows us what the audience will see. Whereas the camera that we see here is really just us sort of moving around the environment. We can see that AniCam right here, and we can also see it over here in our outliner, which we'll get to in just a moment. The last one here is the switch to perspective versus orthographic. So it's just removing some of the understanding of the 3-dimensionality as we toggle there. You'll see right here, user perspective. So we do want to stay within the perspective unless we flip over to one of the orthographic views, such as the top orthographic or side orthographic, whichever one is most handy at the time. So we'll keep that to make sure that it says user perspective and just kind of move around our space a little bit until we get a little bit more comfortable. So great, so that's all of this section except for some of the tools and this bar here. Let's jump over to the outliner. And again, we can see that right here under data, it has that outliner. Okay, so great, so we see this scene collection. This is a default scene inside of Blender. So the scene collection here, this is sort of like groups. So things that logically might group together. You can put into a collection so that it's easier to navigate once you have a more populated scene. So by default, there is a single collection simply called collection, and I can take all of those things and hide them in a simple group, which is nice and easy. I can, if you have something that is collapsed here, you can always expand it just like many programs that we find. The first thing out of the gate here is the camera. So I can activate that by simply clicking on it. So I do have my object selection box. I'm just rubber band selecting that by clicking and dragging over it, or I can select it here in the outliner. So there is a little bit of a discrepancy between the selection and what is selected in the outliner. But so if you find that some of your selections or your windows aren't working, just double check to make sure that you are selected here and selected there, or vice versa. One is selected, the other one's selected. Okay, we can turn off visibility on any one of these, and we can also dig a little deeper to get into some of the shape nodes. That's getting a little bit more advanced, but the properties are there for us to take advantage of. So for that's really a running list of everything that's in our scene. So as we create new objects, they will populate in this outliner. So it can be very, very helpful to keep your eye on that, and almost like a roll call. Okay, so down here, we can see again that these are our properties. This is under the data menu set here. I'm gonna make this a little bit larger. There we go. Because sometimes things get cut off depending on what you're trying to work with here. I am going to click once to select the cube. I can do that within the outliner by selecting this, or just by clicking the gray. Try to avoid the cursor here. It's a little annoying as a Maya user, but hello, Blender. You're free and we love you. So great. So let's take a look at some of these right here. This is very similar to the attribute editor for my Maya users. For those of you who are new to 3D space, don't even worry about it. So right here, you can see that these top, what is that, 6, 5, are all white. So these tend to have, impact on the general scene, the render quality, the scene quality, those types of things. And you'll notice as I start to move from, let's say, the camera to the cube to the light, those white ones are all staying static, but everything at this orange and below tends to change depending on what is selected. So that's what I mean that it's very close to the attribute editor. Depending on your selection, you will see something a little bit different on the base of this, this property editor. So again, I'm just going to select the cube because we'll mainly be working with geometry, although we will jump into the camera very slightly. So this first one has to do with the tool settings. So I mentioned this previously, where we have a tool active, right? And we can see some of the basic properties here that we can adjust about how this tool interacts with our scene. But then we can dig a little bit deeper in the tool settings within the property editor itself. So that can be really helpful if you're not quite getting to the nitty-gritty that you need to. So that's this one with the gears. This next one, and it is worth mentioning that Blender does a really good job, putting tooltips up. So if you're ever curious about what something is officially called, you can always hover over it, and then you can see the little pop-up box with the text in it. That's called, the tooltip. So the render properties are here. Right, again, we're going to be doing this, but a little bit later down the line, maybe when we're in animation and rendering, so we can take a look at what comes out of this, right, so that we can share it with the people that we know and we love. So the next one here is the output properties. So how does it actually print out? It's a printer here, if you want to think of it like that. So will it be a static image? Will it be an MP4 file? What are the dimensions of that? Is it going to be 1080p? Is it going to be 4K? So all of that can be handled inside of here, including some of the where it's saved as well. Okay. This next one, we're not really going to deal with render passes, but this has to do with different layer properties and how they go about, rendering and producing. Let's see, what's this one? So this is the scene properties. Right, so again, we're not going to be dealing with this too much, so I'm just going to fly over some of these that we don't need. We might pop in there for a second for the color, but otherwise we should be pretty good. I'm going to slow down here. This is the object properties. So because I have the cube selected, we can see that the transform, right, and I could click and drag on this and move that around, right, if I didn't want to use the tools to do that. And I'll get to that in just a second. There's rotation and scale. There's also the delta, so this is a little bit more finite in control. The next little collapsible menu here is relation, so if there's a parent, meaning that this object looks to another object to move around, is it part of a collection? Currently it's part of this collection. Is there instances, does it follow a path to understand its animation and motion? is it visible? What happens when it's in this viewport? What can I see about it? And then custom properties that you can add to this specific object. So you'll see some of the same stuff, even though I just flipped over to the camera or the light, for example. You'll notice with these all collapsed that nothing changed. So this is really how things sort of move around and exist in the landscape. So jumping down here, however, we do have modifiers. We will jump into this very, very briefly. These blue ones right here won't impact us for this series in particular. They're a little bit more advanced. So here's particle properties, which if I click on that just sort of is blank, and then a little bit of the physics that we can enact on this selection. So those two we really won't use. We may use this one. This is constraints, so similar to parenting, but slightly different. And we'll get there. Modifiers can be fun, and they're really easy. As you fly out this menu, it's like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff going on here. But very, very simply here, you could do something along these generate lines, such as an array. I'll just choose this first one here, and then go through each one of these modifiers, right? So you can see that I can add multiple. Let's do, let's do a wireframe. Okay, so you can add multiple on here. I can delete these. I can say don't render it, right? So there's lots of different things that you can stack up that's going to modify this particular selection. You notice that it's not doing anything to anything else in the scene. It's simply a modifier stack for this selection. If you are adding a little bit crazily, you can always X these out using the little X, and now it's back to its normal behavior. One thing to mention about these modifiers, the stacking order does matter. So if you have an array first and then a displacement, it's going to do them in that order. So just be careful how you stack them, and you can adjust that by using these little arrows here. So here, the displacement, this is where it gets a little truncated and you can't see it. There you go. So the displace comes first, but I can make the array come first. Okay. So again, those are fun. So I like to spend a little bit of time just taking a look at that. But let's jump down to this section here. Or actually, we'll go here. So this has the material, and then the brush is down here at the bottom, which we won't use. So the material we will get into, and we'll likely do some of that within the shading panel, just because it's a little bit easier to look at and access, through a full screen rather than a portion of a screen. Rounding our way out down here at the bottom in the layout tab, we do have the timeline. So this is where I can actually animate and play back my animation. So just to give us a little idea here, let me do a keyframe on that. Oh, my hotkeys are already messed up. There we go. And we'll push that over there. Okay, so with keyframes, we can very quickly move things about and then adjust the way that it works. We can hit play here, right? And we can see that it's jumping across the scene. And the nice thing about this that I wish Maya would do, maybe in 2023 we'll get this, but is this stacked area. So it's a little hard to see here, but you have the actual cube, and then if anything else happens, it's going to stack up different keyframes versus one solid timeline. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these. And there we go. There we go. And get that back roughly to the beginning if I wanted to jump back to the transform and put that directly in the middle, so we're all in the same place, and we can do that. So again, we can see there's a lot of different ways to interact with the timeline, including how the keyframes actually work, and we can get different views within here and modify any markers or add markers to help us. You already saw me doing this before where I was, playing. You can jump to the beginning or the end or to the next keyframe. This is your current keyframe. So I could type in 25 here, and it would take me the playhead to that 25th frame. I can also see here that we have the start and end frame. Now this is for the entire length. If I wanted to just look at a single section, I could use this here to kind of zoom in. Okay. So lots of fun things to look at. I'll just put that there. Mostly we want to stay, with whatever we need here. Right down at the bottom, and that's really, I know I'm like right behind myself here. You can see that there is still some tooltips, and that will change based off of which tool you have active. So that can always be a fun place to look in the lower left-hand corner to see what that tool can do, at least what they can, work with with given this small area. Last little section right down here can be very helpful. This is sort of a heads-up display coming from Maya. So the scene collection, you have the cube selected. There's 8 verts on the cube. There's 6 faces, 12 tries. So that can be really helpful to just very quickly get a sense for your scene, how much memory, and the version which we took a look at before. Okay. All right, we're almost there. So this little section right here and this part right here are really impactful for what you're trying to do. So I'm going to cover those very quickly. So object mode here, this is where we'll be kind of flipping back and forth between the object mode and the edit mode. You'll notice for my industry compatible hotkeys, my key map, I can use the keystroke of 4 or 1 to jump between those modes. And there's a couple main differences that we'll see here. The object mode, I can select this, I can move it around, and there I'm tapping W, but you could also use the move tool here. Rotate is E, and scale is R, just like in Maya because of the industry compatible hotkeys. So we can move this around using the green arrow to just lock it into that Y right left orient within Blender space, the X here, or the up down with the blue, the Z. And I'm going to hit Control Z here to undo all of those actions and get it back to the 0, or simply zero it out with the cube selected, the object properties, transform rolled out, and then using these transform controls. Jumping over to the rotate or tapping E on my keyboard, I can do the same thing. So here you'll notice as I click and drag on just the green, it will rotate it around that green axis or Y. Here's the X or red, and here's the blue or Z. And if that seems rather odd to you, the correspondence of the colors and the axes, I usually try to remind you X, Y, Z, RGB. So X corresponds with R, so that's red. So red, green, blue, right? X, Y, Z, RGB. So that can be helpful just to sort of let your mind grapple with it. So each one of those, if you click directly on the color ring, then that will lock it into that orientation. But if you click and drag anywhere that's not the colored ring, you will rotate it in all directions. And we can see how these rotates are really going nuts over here as I sort of click and drag on that. Okay, so let me hit Control Z here to undo those, and we can, or just zeroing them out through the properties panel here, and then scale R on my keyboard or right over here. Again, I can scale this with just the Y, just the X, just the Z, or if I hover here, I can do in all directions, proportionate to its current status. I'm hitting Control Z here. I can also use these little planes to scale like that. And you'll notice that because that one's red, right, red corresponds with the X orient, it's not scaling the X. So this is sort of a negation action. Same thing here. So this one's along blue, so that one will negate the blue. This one will negate the red, or the green, which is Y. Okay, so hitting Control Z again to get us back to 1, 1, 1 and 0, 0, 0 right up here at the top. Okay, the next ones here, annotate and measure. We're not really going to use those, but these are all in object mode. So if I flip over to edit, we'll notice that I get a lot more tools down here at the bottom. And this is editing because it's a sphere, the sphere. And we'll notice that let me get a little bit closer here so we can see that better. We'll notice that the corners, the vertices, do show up in orange. So that's my vertex mode here. I have my edge mode and my face mode. Again, we're not going to do too much editing, but it's useful to know that if it looks a little bit different, you're probably in a different mode. So just tap 4 on your keyboard and you'll have less tools, and you really just have to worry about moving things around and making the animation work for you. Okay, so back in object mode, I'm going to cover these four little buttons here, and just to denote that it looks a little bit different in edit mode because you have more command over the mesh, the vertex, the edge, face, and UVs. So I'm going to jump back to the object mode because I want to move this and edit it as a whole object, and think a little bit more broadly about the scene. So when I'm in the edit mode, I'm really focused, laser focused on the object that is selected, right? So if I jump over to something else, it might give me a little bit of an error because there, the light doesn't have any faces and that type of thing. So just be cognizant which mode you're in. So back in the object mode, I'm just going to come back up here to my selection box and clear my selection by clicking once in the empty space here. We'll notice nothing is selected because of that. I can choose this view. This is where I can see my toolbar, right? So this is my toolbar right here. My sidebar, which we didn't cover before. Actually, let me just hide that for a second. You can see this little arrow, and if I click and drag on that, that will bring out my my toolbar here, or my sidebar. And I can flip over to the tool selections, the view, right, and edit some things with that. It gets a little crowded there, so that's why you can either push that back in, but you do have to be right over that arrow. Otherwise, I'm just going to be moving that right side column, right, those panels, or use this, or use the hotkey. So with the industry compatible hotkeys, that's Control and the right bracket key. My tool settings are up there at the top. Right? And we have that one doesn't really matter. Oh, frame selection. So with an object selected, I could tap F on my keyboard to frame or focus in on it. I can also do that here. Frame all is going to take everything within the entire scene and frame it within your viewport. So that one's A. We can do the perspective to orthographic. We did that previously with this button here. And toggling to local view. We're really not going to use that, so I'm going to go back. Different cameras. So if we go back to the active camera, that was this button that we used before. Okay. The viewport, we can adjust these to different orthographic views or the camera, right? You can see the hotkeys associated with that. We've been using some of these, which tend to be a little bit faster, but if you really love your F3 key, then go for it. Navigation, we've been doing this with either the Alt key or the gimbal up here at the top. Okay, but there's also some stuff at the bottom that we couldn't quite, right? So zoom region. So if I tap Z on my keyboard, I can click and drag and zoom into a specific, let me make that a little bit more apparent. So tapping Z, just simple Z, and then click and drag, and that will zoom into whatever that bounding box was that I created. So that's this one. Align view, this is to try to make your active camera close to your render camera. View regions, play animation, which we were doing down here, and some of the renders. Okay, so that's our view menu. A lot of the stuff we'll do with hotkeys or with readily available tools, so we won't spend too much time in that menu set. Underneath select, this is what it sounds like, so I'm going to select things. We've been doing this with the selection object. So box select, circle select, those are also found if you click and hold on the object underneath this tool. So you can see that also with any one of these that has that little chevron in the lower right-hand corner. So that will help you find other tools that are related to that one. Let's see. Some other stuff we're not really going to use. You can do some different selections based off of how that is grouped or linked or what have you. We are going to use the add quite frequently, so we can add in a mesh. You can see that I always get the students who want to add in the monkey, so go nuts with that and do it while you can. So the mesh is there. We can see cylinders, cubes are the most common that will probably start from there, but that's all under the add menu. We have some surfaces, so these are all NURBs, which is different than the polygon items that we've been adding thus far. So let me just jump down. There's text here, armature, which is more about bones and creating, basically a puppet rig to move things in accordance with an armature. Lattice empty, we might use this. So these are basically like null objects, if you're familiar with that from something like After Effects. So this is very helpful in rigging or in trying to command something through a control or otherwise trying to group things together to move them around. Importing images, so that could be a reference or a background, creating lights, or a light probe, a camera, some speakers, force fields, and creating a new collection so that you can group things. So that's a very helpful menu, just to sort of walk through and understand what's available to you. Underneath the object, this we've looked at a little bit already with the transforms. Okay, setting the origin, we didn't quite take a look at this. This has to do with this little cursor um, and the origin of the actual object itself, so you can set how it sort of pivots. You can think of that as like the anchor point if you're coming to me from After Effects, or the center of that manipulation. Mirroring, clearing out, applying different details or transformations. Snapping we did up here previously. Duplicating objects, so Control D, which is similar to many different programs, as well as copy and paste, which do inherit the traditional Control C, Control V hotkeys in there. There's parenting, adding to collections, making different types of relationships other than parenting, and constraints are found in here. So most of this we won't specifically look at, but it's nice to kind of look at all of the menus and see what's available to you as you start to poke around. So that's the main aspects that we'll take a look at. I am just going to save this out. So underneath here, again, if you find that there's anything that you need or that you're looking for, usually you can create that interface based off of what you're looking for. The render is here, editing, so the undo, Control Z, we've already done that. You can take a look at your history as it works with your scene, and we did take a look at the preferences, which is really, and I'll just very quickly pop through these so that we can make sure that if you have any problems and yours isn't behaving like mine, this is a good place to just make sure that everything is accurate to what I'm doing. So viewports, there you go. I'll expand selection here. Lights in here should really be probably just editing an animation that might be different from the defaults. And add-ons, this is really helpful. So let me just click once right here so you can see what's added on to my version. So if that doesn't quite align with what you have, you might not see some of the things that I have working with us. And I don't think I have any testing ones right now. But this is really super helpful. So for example, I could type in, I don't know, extra. So you can add in these extra objects, right? Simply by adding in those plugins. And there's official ones, there's ones created by the community since it's open source, and then there's ones that are still being tested, as that's more for advanced users who are trying to help out. So you definitely can do that. There's my inputs and my navigation. My key mapping we already talked about, system, save and load, and file paths. So that should be it for this one. You just want to do, we'll probably start a new one here, but we can also do some importing here, which is really nice, doing some cleanup in case your computer's getting a little bogged down, but it shouldn't with what we're trying to do. And then also to get back to the splash screen, right? So you can get back in there. And that can be helpful. You just click away from that if needed. So that's it for this one. File new, and we'll start with the next one.